Good afternoon and welcome to the third session of the Social Security Academy for Interns. It's called Unfiltered Straight Talk of Social Security. And my name is Hiram Lopez. I'm actually representing National Academy of Social Insurance. I happen to be the Stark intern, one of the 4 programs that National Academy of Social Insurance has. And I'm not here to advertise, but we do have a brochure in the folder. Take a look at it. And it happens to be a paid internship. Once again, paid. Before I go on, I would like to also personally thank every single one of you that has been here throughout the day. You took time off your busy schedule to learn about an issue that's going to be talked in the White House and in Congress in the next few months, whether you believe it or not. Before I introduce my 2 panelists here, I would like to briefly tell you about them. The first panelist, his name is Alexander Hertel-Fernandez. He likes to be called Alex, so during question and answer, you can call him Alex. He works on issues on health reform and social policy at the Economic Policy Institute. Alex has also served as a senior fellow for social insurance with the Roosevelt Institution and was the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship. He has published research on public health and political economy of social insurance. Again, their bios are in your folder, so I'm not going to tell you more about them. And if you want to get to know them, of course, they're going to be here for the question and answer and right after as well. On the other hand, we have Mr. Marc Goldwein, also known as Mark, is the policy director of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget as well as senior policy analyst at the New America Foundation. There he guides and conducts research on a wide array of topics, including tax policy, healthcare policy, entitlement reform. He's also a consultant to the World Bank and visiting scholar at the Institution of Governmental Studies. I would like to tell you the strategy we're going to use for the debate. This is not a presidential debate. It's more of a friendly debate, so please don't take it too personal. First, we're going to have one of the speakers come for 15 minutes. First 5 minutes, he's going to give a brief presentation of his background and his organization, and then the next 10 minutes, it's about the topic. And after those 15 minutes, we're going to have the other speaker come up and give his presentation, and then we're going to have them both seated. One of them is going to have 5 minutes for a rebuttal, and then right after the other gentleman is going to have 5 minutes for a rebuttal. And then we're going to open it to questions for the rest of the public to actually ask them. So I would like to give a warm welcome to Mr. Alex to please come up and give his presentation.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for moderating this panel. And thanks also to the National Academy of Social Insurance for hosting this event, which I think is incredibly important to all of you and to the broader community to have you guys learning about such an essential part of our lives in the American tradition. And I also want to congratulate you guys, the interns, for sticking it out past lunch. Give a round of applause to yourselves. As a policy wonk, it's always neat to see that there are other people out there that care this much about learning about long-run budget projections and tax rates, or at least some balance between that and free food, of course. And if you, as you're realizing today, or if you didn't already, Social Security is such an essential part of the American political economy, an essential issue for all Americans, be they young or old. And while it's true that it may be half a century until we all retire, Social Security is still an enormously important political and economic issue. As you've already learned, it is an essential source of income for millions of children and teenagers with deceased, retired, or disabled parents, and in the face of rapidly eroding private pensions, is an increasingly important source of retirement savings. Today, I wanted to talk about the state of Social Security, seeing as you have already probably heard up to your ears about the structure of the program and how it operates, and talk a little bit about how I think it's important to frame the options for reform. And as Hiram already said, I work for the Economic Policy Institute, and while I'm representing them here today, my views are my own, and none of this should be interpreted as the official policy stance of EPI or the Roosevelt Institution. So to start us off, as you've already probably learned, Social Security is important, but a modest asset for retired workers. And here you can see the average amount a retired worker receives per year versus the poverty line and the basic expenses necessary for homeowners and renters. And although Social Security was never intended to be a supplement, it was always intended to be a supplement to other forms of retirement income, it is actually now the primary source of income for most retired Americans. For 2 out of 3 beneficiaries, Social Security is half or more of their income. And for a third of all beneficiaries, Social Security is almost all of their income. So you can see that the dynamic of the program has changed from its inception. But it's important to remember also that Social Security isn't retirement savings, and it's not welfare. It's social insurance against disability, death, inflation, and the risk of outliving one's savings when one retires. Social Security, as a form of this insurance, protects against these losses in ways that traditional private savings accounts cannot. Despite the fact that Social Security has had such a successful tenure in the American political economy, often the news stories that you hear today are associated with crisis and the projected shortfall in Social Security. And there are claims that we can no longer, as an economy, support paying these benefits. As you've already probably heard, there are a couple different perspectives to this story. And I just wanted to reiterate the projections that have been made most recently by the Social Security Administration and put these into context when we think about the long-run fate of Social Security. So as you may have already been told today, Social Security has been accumulating a surplus, in fact, for the past 20-odd years or so, and is building up a trust fund. It means it's actively taking in more money than it needs to continue its operation. Here we see a graph of the trust fund and different projections into the future, and this is from the Social Security Administration. So you can see here that the surplus is actually projected to increase until about 2012, at which point it could take any number of paths. And the reason why there are 3 different lines up there is because they're with different sets of assumptions about the future, different sets of assumptions about how our economy is going to grow, different sets of assumptions about how our population is going to change. The dynamic of the long-run projection changes as well. Under a low-cost, optimistic situation, you can see that there's no long-run shortfall at all. Under a more intermediate set of assumptions, you can see that the trust fund will continue to grow and then ultimately fall out and be depleted around 2041. And under a high-cost set of assumptions, you can see that that happens relatively faster. So the bottom line here is that the future is unclear, but there is some sort of a long-run shortfall that we need to keep in mind, and we should think about policy options to change that. However, there's no imminent crisis, as you can see here. We're running a surplus right now and will for the next several years. So we should think about carefully, and we think about basing our values, what sort of changes we want to see in Social Security. So what is causing this long-run shortfall? As many of the stories associated with Social Security would have you think, it's demographic trends in our society. The fact that people are living longer, the fact that there are more retirees, the baby boomers that are about to retire. Well, when we look at an economic analysis of this long-run shortfall, these trends aren't actually driving the shortfall. It accounts for about 5%. The vast majority of the shortfall is caused by economic, not demographic changes in American society, namely sluggish wage growth, and erosion of the tax base due to growing income inequality. So to think about that for just a second, what does it mean for Social Security that there is staggering income inequality over the past 20 years that only continues to grow? How could this affect Social Security's finances for the future? Well, in order to consider that, we have to think about how Social Security taxes work. Social Security taxes don't work like income taxes, as you may have learned this morning. It ends at a certain amount, after which your wages are not taxed. And that amount changes every year depending on the average wages for a given year. In 2009, the amount that the cap appeared at was about $107,000. That means, for example, if you're lucky enough to receive $200,000 a year, any amount over that cap won't be taxed. Whereas if you make under that cap, the full amount of your income is taxed. So to return to our question about what is driving the long-run shortfall, income inequality, you can start to see here how this might play into it. If people are earning more and more money that is above the cap, that's money that Social Security isn't taxing and is slipping right through. In fact, we see this in this second chart here that shows in the bottom line, the percent of American workers that are above the cap. You can see here that the number of people that are making above the cap has stayed relatively consistent, but the amount of money that they're earning has grown at a staggering rate. The top line represents the percent of earnings that are above the cap, and you can see that that's really just shot up since the 1980s. And this means that more and more of the wages of top earners are escaping Social Security taxation. That means that Social Security is collecting less money than it should. And here we see a graph of taxable Social Security wages as a size of the American economy, of GDP. And you can see that this has also been eroding over time. As a final point, I also want to talk about the broader place of Social Security within budget and fiscal debates. You often also hear in the news about entitlement crises and why we need to lump Social Security in with Medicare and Medicaid in order to address these problems regarding our long-run fiscal future. And while I think it's important to think long and hard about the problems of each and every one of these programs, I think it's a mistake to conflate the issues regarding one program with the others. Here we see a graph of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid projected into the future. These are the expected costs of the programs. And we can see here that Social Security is relatively consistent. There's a slight bump up, as you can see there, which is a one-time level change. That's the baby boomers retiring, which in large part is accounted for by the Social Security surplus or trust fund. Medicare and Medicaid, on the other hand, are where we see the real staggering growth, and that's just astronomical. But that, of course, isn't a Medicare and Medicaid problem. That's a healthcare problem. And when we look at the statistics, in fact, Medicare and Medicaid actually their costs are increasing at a rate that's slower when we control for a variety of factors than the private health sector. So this graph shows why we need healthcare reform. And it also shows that it's a mistake to conflate the Social Security's long-run shortfall with the healthcare crisis. Finally, when we think about options for reform, what sort of backdrop do we want to have? What sort of values do we want to have going into this debate about how to change Social Security? I believe that there are 4 key points. The first is that benefits are already modest, but represent such an important source of income for the majority of American retirees. The second point is that we have already raised the retirement age to 67 during a set of reforms about 20 years ago, and this is slowly being phased in. I think it's also important to remember that raising the retirement age is simply a benefit cut by any other name. And if you want to engage in changing these benefits, you should call it as such. And finally, tagging closely onto that, it's a very difficult issue to talk about raising the retirement age because the truth of the matter is that some, but not all Americans can work longer. While indeed on average, Americans are living longer and longer each year, and that's something to be celebrated, not all American workers can continue working for so long. You know, it's quite possible for example, a college professor, I'm sure you've all had college professors before that looks like they are well past their time, but they are perfectly able to function. And you know, it's great, and it's great that these people can continue to contribute to our economy. But for someone else, a blue-collar worker that works in the mines or in a factory with day labor day in and day out, it's very difficult to ask them to work longer. Finally, there are very important disparities in life expectancy by race and socioeconomic status that are of great concern when we consider raising the retirement age. So with that backdrop for reform, I just wanted to reiterate what I think Social Security's biggest strength is. And I know I'm running out of time, so I promise this is my last slide. When we think about changing Social Security and when we think about retirement security in America on a whole, what is Social Security's comparative advantage? What is its strength? No matter what, it's there for you, no matter what happens to your income, or more importantly, whatever happens to the stock market. I thought that I'd make this little comparison here by looking at my 401k over the past year and seeing how it's done. And you can see here that it's kind of depressing, and I, for one, am fairly happy that I don't have to retire anytime soon. But it's a much more serious matter for people who are considering retiring soon that saw such a hit in their retirement portfolios. Given the fact that most people's income is in the stock market, taking such a huge hit can be really devastating. On Social Security, on the other hand, keeps chugging away, guaranteeing you benefits no matter what happens to you or the stock market. So I think on that note, I'll close and turn over the microphone to Marc, who will give an alternate perspective for looking at reform of Social Security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. Now I would like to turn the podium to Marc.
How do we put my slide presentation up? It's ready. Cool. Thanks very much, Alex. I am curious why in your retirement fund you have a retirement in 2010 option.
All my options open.
Yeah, I mean, you never know with this economy. Thank you very much. So I think I agreed with about the first minute and a half of what you said, and after that, we might diverge a little bit. I want to thank Hiram for introducing me, and I am policy director at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, but I'm here in my capacity at the New America Foundation, and I want to give the disclaimer that nothing I say today represents the committee or the New America Foundation. They're my opinions and mine alone. I also want to thank the National Academy of Social Insurance for hosting this event. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. I myself was a NASI intern just 2 years ago, and it's a great experience, and you guys should learn everything you can while you have the chance. So I guess I want to give a few main points. First, and here I absolutely agree with Alex, and I think everyone here, Social Security is an absolutely vital social insurance program. It lifts millions of seniors out of poverty. It provides needed support to survivors and disabled workers, and it does so without the stigma attached to welfare or the risks of investment. Unfortunately, I think the numbers are clear. Social Security is on an unsustainable path. In only a few years, Social Security is going to stop running surpluses and begin running large deficits. The trustees project that will happen in 2016. After that point, those deficits will increase every year, requiring us to take money away from general revenue, which means that we're either going to have lower spending or higher taxes elsewhere. Eventually, by 2037, I think, under current projections, Social Security's trust fund is going to empty. At that point, we'd need either a cut in spending equal to around 25% or a 33% or 4% of payroll increase in taxes. And that's a very drastic change I don't think anyone is ready for, and we couldn't really do suddenly. That said, and I also want to point out that these projections aren't that uncertain. It's true that under the trustees' low-cost scenario, where they take sort of all the factors and they assume that everything happens the best that it will, the trust fund doesn't run out of money. But here they've done an analysis of the probability of what's going to happen. And with a 97.5% probability, the trust fund's going to run out of money before 2050. Within 50%, it's going to run out before 2040, or 60%. So I think this problem is real, and it's something that we need to start dealing with. The problem has also worsened just because of the economic crisis. We were expecting large surpluses, 50 to 100 billion over the next few years. Those no longer are going to exist. Instead, we're going to have $10, $20 billion surpluses for a few years, followed by an earlier and deeper deficit in the Social Security system. But it's worse than that, because the Social Security system is part of an overall debt problem facing the country. Somewhat because of its cost, but also because of others. We're projected to increase our debt astronomically over the next few years and over the next century or so. In World War II, we were talking about 100% debt, and that was only for a year or two. Now that's projected to happen in peacetime, and we simply can't sustain that. That much public debt means that we're going to have less money for private investment. It means that government's going to have to dedicate more of its fund to interest payments instead of the spending programs we all love. And it means that our programs are an unsustainable course. Alex pointed out, and he's right, we shouldn't blame this on Social Security necessarily. If we look at the key driver, it's not Social Security but Medicare. Social Security, CBO has projected, the Congressional Budget Office, is going to account for about 20% of entitlement growth over the next, by 2035, and only about 10% by the end of the 75-year period. The rest is really coming from Medicare and Medicaid. That said, even though Social Security isn't the main driver of the problem, it has to be part of the solution. Well, one reason is that we just can't get Medicare and Medicaid's costs low enough. Again, Alex pointed out, we don't have just an entitlement problem for Medicare and Medicaid. I have a 5-minute mark, I gotta go faster. We have a healthcare problem. Right now, healthcare costs are growing 2.5% per year faster than the economy. But even if we slowed it to 1%, as the administration thinks it does, Medicare's costs would still triple by the end of the 75-year period. And even if we got healthcare costs to stop growing altogether, they'd still grow by 60%. So there's no way, really, that we can control Medicare and Medicaid enough to solve the entire problem. That means looking at revenue and looking at other spending and looking at Social Security. At the same time, Social Security is part of a broader aging problem and can be part of that aging solution. Again, the Congressional Budget Office projects that because we're getting older, having less children, and living longer, population aging is going to be the key driver of entitlement growth over the next 20, 30 years. Looking over the long run, healthcare is a bigger driver, something like 55%, but we're still talking about aging being very, very significant. And Social Security can give us the tools to help fix it. So I guess, what should our goals of Social Security reform be? I guess I had 3. First, we need to continue to protect the elderly, disabled, and those at risk of falling into poverty. Secondly, we need to find a way to bring costs in line with revenues. And finally, we need to use Social Security reform as a lever to mitigate the effects of population aging. I'll work backwards because I think this is the most interesting point. There's a few ways we can mitigate the effects of population aging. One is we could increase fertility, or we could increase immigration. The Social Security system can't really do a lot in that field, unless they want to start sending pamphlets telling people to have more kids or something. Or other things we probably shouldn't discuss here. But the Social Security system, through reform, can encourage people to work longer and can increase national and personal savings. And that, in turn, can contribute, although it's not going to do it by itself, to improve productivity growth, which also helps with the whole aging problem. Social Security has a few tools at its disposal to help people retirement later, but the main ones are the normal retirement age and the early retirement age. If we raise the normal retirement age and the early retirement age, we could solve around a quarter to a third of Social Security's problems, depending on how we do it. But there are benefits beyond that. In addition to lower Social Security costs and higher payroll tax revenue, we'd also get higher revenue for the income tax. And retirees, since they'd be working longer, would have more time to accumulate wealth and would spend less time spending down those assets. And finally, a bigger labor force and more investment means faster economic growth, which is something we're going to need to get out of this problem. I think the second way that we can use Social Security reform to mitigate the effects of aging is through some type of mandatory savings accounts. Now, I'm not talking about replacing Social Security in any way with private accounts. What I'm talking about is doing it on top. In theory, we don't even need to use Social Security. President Obama has a plan that would just automatically enroll everyone in a 401k or IRA with their employer. And we could also look at his Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel's plan to mandate 2% accounts outside of Social Security. The advantages of doing this within Social Security, I think, are twofold. First, we already have a payroll tax withdrawal system in place, and we can get low administrative costs if we use the current Social Security system. And secondly, we can coordinate the new benefits that you'll reap from your private accounts with any cuts that we're going to have to make in spending. And I just think that's a better way to do it. Alex showed us his 401k, which isn't doing very well. And he's right, stocks are risky, certainly much riskier than Social Security. But over the long run, they do actually tend to do pretty well. Andrew Biggs sort of did this thought experiment. What if instead of Social Security, we had private accounts? And people all retired in the end of 2008, which was when the stock market was at its worst point in God knows how long. Even under that scenario, anyone who started saving before age 47 still was better off. And even those who started saving later were not really much worse off. So I think as an add-on to Social Security, we should be okay with private accounts, and they have a lot of benefits. I'm down to 1 minute, so I'm going to go very quick. And I know you guys already discussed this in your lunch section, but really, we can't get around making the hard choices. We have to cut someone's benefits, raise someone's taxes. There's a lot of ways to do it. We can discuss that later. Ultimately, what we decide comes down to our values and our priorities. I think I have 3, and everyone in this room may differ. First, I think that benefits should target those most in need, particularly low earners. But secondly, I think Social Security is most valuable as a universal system. So those 2 points lead me to think that the way to go to get the rest of the problem is to look at cutting benefits for the wealthy, for those who rely on Social Security the least. And my last principle, I think, is going to be the most unpopular here, based on your presentation so far. And I go back and forth on it. But I think tax increases should be kept to a minimum. I mean, I'm very sympathetic. I want to keep benefits how they are. And I do think we should raise the payroll tax cap some. But we need to look at the overall fiscal situation. We only have the economy and politics has a limit to how much you can increase taxes. And we're spending out of control. And the fact is we're going to need tax increases just to pay for Medicare, just to pay for Medicaid, to pay for infrastructure, to pay for the programs we need. So I'm not sure if I would use those limited tax increases that we have on Social Security, especially if we're supplementing people's retirement with another form of account. And I look forward to now discussing with Alex how our values and priorities differ. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goldwein. Now we have 5 minutes of rebuttal from Mr. Fernandez, and we're going to go ahead and get started.
Oof, 5 minutes. All right. Well, I agree very much with your last slide that whatever we talk about and whatever we think about as policy solutions should be grounded in our values. What do we want from our society? If not only because it can get boring to look at these long-run forecasts over and over and over again. I think first I'd like to talk about the issue of debt in the long term. I think that there is good debt and there's bad debt, and a lot of it depends on what we spend it on. Right now, we are in the worst recession that we've ever seen by a lot of measures, with skyrocketing unemployment and a labor market that's rapidly deteriorating. And I think that it's important to think about our long-run fiscal future in a balanced way, but to talk about, making cuts to our spending in a time when the labor market is shedding millions and millions of jobs, I think is a very dangerous thing. Moving on to the specific issue of Social Security, I agree with the vast majority of your points. I think that there is a long-run shortfall that we have to think about, but where we differ is I think we should target what is driving the shortfall. And as my presentation showed, it's the skyrocketing income inequality that is driving this shortfall, and it is the way Social Security collects its taxes. So I think that's where we should focus our search for our solutions on. And as you mentioned, you'd be open to moving the cap, restoring it to the 90% mark, where perhaps where it was, or maybe some sort of a compromise. One of the economists at the Economic Policy Institute put forward a proposal that kind of splits the difference, where on the employer side of contributions, the cap would be eliminated, but the 90% mark would still be restored for workers, and that would close more than 75% of the long-run projected shortfall in Social Security. And we deem this to be an important, if not great step, because of course, the inherent uncertainty of economic forecasts mean that we don't really know for sure how big the gap is, and closing over 75% would be a great step forward. I think that we should encourage, in every case that we can, later retirement for people who can retire later. But I think it's very dangerous to talk about moving the goalpost for people that are from lower socioeconomic stratum, for people who are minorities who aren't going to live as long, and this is going to represent a big benefit cut for them. So while I do think we should pursue avenues for kind of nudging, as Cass Sudstein would say, people in the right direction to retire later, I don't think that we should make some sort of mandatory cut in benefits that way. I'd like to close with 2 points, one on healthcare and one on mandatory savings accounts. On healthcare, I think that I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think that we have the potential to implement some real game changers that are going to slow the rate of cost growth, but it's hanging very precariously on what happens in the next couple of weeks. But I think that needs to be a separate discussion away from Social Security. As you've mentioned, Social Security's problems are its own, and if anything, it's actually been defraying the debt that the U.S. government has been running up. I'd like to close on the idea of mandatory savings accounts. Social Security was never intended to be the primary source of retirement income, and I think it's great that we're looking at mandatory private account add-ons in addition to Social Security, but I'd encourage you to look more in the direction of a plan that looks a little bit more like a defined benefit plan than a defined contribution plan. There are just tons of well-documented failings of the 401k and just private defined contribution plans in general, not least of all, the very high administrative costs. And to shunt everyone into a failing system, I think, is a mistake. We should instead look to some sort of guaranteed retirement account. And another proposal put forward by the Economic Policy think tank that could guarantee a certain amount of benefits to everyone. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. Mr. Goldwein, you have 5 minutes to rebuttal.
Sure. I think I'm going to work backwards and start by agreeing with you again. I think we should have mandatory accounts. I think that there are a lot of features of defined benefit systems where instead of you determining how much money you're putting in, you decide how much money you're getting out. I think there are a lot of them that can be part of it. I think annuitization and other things. I think that using the government or some type of agency to lower administrative costs through larger deployment mechanism can also be useful. So I think that we're not that far apart on that. On healthcare, you're right. There are some game changers, and the administration thinks those game changers can bend the healthcare cost curve down. But I've showed that even if we get the healthcare cost curve to 0, we still have a Medicare and Medicaid problem. So then we're faced with a choice. Do we cut Medicare or Medicaid? Do we cut Social Security? Do we raise taxes? Or do we do all three? And I don't think we're going to get to 0, so I think we're going to have to do all three, unfortunately. Going backwards still, again, I agree, not everybody can retire at age 68, at age 70, of course. But the life expectancy from when Social Security was created till now has gone up substantially. Even, I mean, I have numbers here which my intern got for me that say they've increased from 62 to 78. Thanks, Ryan. I think if we look at retirement age, life expectancy after retirement, it'd be a smaller increase, but still an increase. And the fact is we need to protect the old who need it most. We should have some type of system in place, either a special retirement age or an expanded disability system to cover those who we lose in the gap. But we need to start sending the right signals to people that you can't retire, we can't all retire at 62 and 63 and still get through this aging bubble or through this aging crisis. Ultimately, I'm not sure whether points of disagreement we have, other than I just think that we really need to think hard about the choices we're going to make. And we need to realize that any tax increase in Social Security means we're going to have less ability to tax increase somewhere else to pay for another priority. And so we just need to think very carefully of what we as a government want to spend on and how much we as a government want to tax our citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Goldwein. Now you see why Social Security is a tricky issue. I'd like to invite every one of you to ask some questions to the panelists, and we have 20 minutes. We will have 2 of our fellow interns be back there with microphones, and just please stand up when you have your question and address your name and the organization you're from. A question back there?
Hi, I'm Feng. I'm currently taking an intern at the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and then I am a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon studying computational finance. Actually, I would just ask both of you, say, using 1 or 2 sentences to conclude, what do you think, what is the main clash of your opinions? Thanks.
The hardest question first.
I want to cut benefits and he doesn't. I think the main difference is whether we think Social Security should be, I think one of the main differences is whether we think Social Security should be dealt with in isolation as its own program or not. And I think the other is sort of where we fall on, are benefits adequate enough, and so we should be focusing on reducing them, or are benefits inadequate, and so we should be focusing on raising new revenue.
Totally agree.
Other questions? Go ahead.
I know we've talked a lot today about increasing solvency, and it was mentioned that administrative costs are only 1%. But I wonder if either of you see a shift in the future towards, making it an easier system to deal with, because I know just looking at disability, you're having people who are disabled doing very difficult paperwork. Between my parents, they have 2 master's degrees and a JD, and they still struggled. And my dad was on a waiting list for 8 months. So I wonder, is there any place in any sort of reform? I know we're all about increasing solvency, cutting costs, and we talk a lot about increasing adequacy of benefits. But I think that you'd solve a lot of problems with Social Security if you just put more money into administrative costs. And even though we hate increasing that percent, what place do you think that has in the debate? And is that even going to get addressed when the administration gets to that?
Well, disability systems administrative costs are higher than the retirement system. But I think you're right, there's huge amounts of backlogs. And depending on what type of administrative costs you're talking about, spending more money can actually reduce costs because it reduces the amount of fraud and it gets people sort of in quicker, so there's less time dealing with them over and over again. I do think I'll be part of the reform because while the politicians are focused on the big picture, there are the experts that are going to focus on making the little changes on the margins, and I hope that they all happen along with major reform. I would overhaul the disability system. I think that it doesn't give anything for partial disability. It doesn't in any way, except for a very small program, encourage people who are able to work part-time. It doesn't give very adequate benefits, and there's not a smooth transition from disability into retirement as I'd like there to be. So I think we need major overhaul. But absent that, I think you're right. We do need more administrative spending and disability.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the problems facing the disability insurance component of Social Security are very unique to its own. And I will not claim to be an expert in that, but I have read kind of the horror stories that happen, and I think that should be an important component of reform. And as I understand it, the proposals to, or kind of the debate around the proposals to change the disability insurance component are a little bit more straightforward and well understood. So,
great, thank you. Any other questions back there?
My name is Kyle Kennedy with the Federal Housing Finance Agency as well. Mark, you were saying that you wanted to put this into a 401k, into a private funded plan. Is that right?
No, I want people to have mandatory private savings on top of Social Security, not in place of it.
Social Security. Okay. Do you see a problem with putting so much money into the financial markets, and when a time like the baby boomers retiring, all of that money exiting at the same time? Do you see it as a potential problem?
I think you have a very good point, which is just as the Social Security system has imbalances, so does the financial market, and it also is affected by population aging. But we're in an international financial market where people are different populations are aging at different times, and ultimately I think we need to be careful about creating bubbles, of course. But I think the amount of new real economic investment we can create will counteract that.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Back there, gentlemen. White shirt.
Hey, my name is Lucas Puente. I'm from the Economic Policy Institute. My question has to do with something on Mr. Goldwein's slide, immigration. As we probably won't get into it this year, but probably the next legislative cycle, immigration will be a huge topic. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on how that will affect Social Security, because as I'm sure both of you are aware, a lot of undocumented workers are contributing to Social Security and not really receiving those benefits at present. So how does that immigration reform debate play into this? Thanks.
Sure. Alex has a plant here. I could see it going on one of two ways, but either way, I think it doesn't matter. I think it doesn't matter because I think that we should decide our values in immigration independent of what we decide on Social Security. On the one hand, we have a lot of people right now who are paying into the Social Security system, who are immigrants who will never receive money on it. So letting them receive money, I think it's the right thing to do, but it would make the system's finances worse. On the other hand, if immigration reform allows us to have more immigrants, we can mitigate some of this aging trend, and that can have positive effects on the system.
Would you like to add, Mr. Fernandez?
To the comment? I agree. I think that, I think it's a mistake to base our changes to our immigration system on the long-run economic projections of Social Security. I think it needs to be done independently of that, but that it, as Mark pointed out, it can have some very positive effects.
Great. Question right here.
Hi, my name is Christina, and I just had a question regarding both of your slides. You both talked about a surplus in Social Security, and I wanted to know why there was such a discrepancy with both of your descriptions of that surplus.
Could you explain what you mean a little more?
Well, you had mentioned that over the next couple of years that there wouldn't be, and we'd be running our costs well above our revenues. And then Alex had mentioned that we're actually making money at the moment, and for a few more years it looks like we're not going to have as huge of a problem depending on those costs. So I just wanted to see where those discrepancies came from, because your charts were very different.
I don't think they were all that different. It was just showing the underlying difficulties of long-run economic forecasts. I think it's important to point out two things. One is that we have been running a surplus, and the surplus is going to be key to helping us defray the cost of the baby boomers' retirement. But the other point is that at some point in time, we're going to have to think about what's going to happen when the trust fund runs out, and that's where I think we can both agree on that we have to start thinking about that now, but in a sensible and rational way, one that doesn't consider it to be an imminent crisis that we have to solve next month or else.
I agree. I don't think we were showing different numbers, but we were emphasizing different things. Both of us agree there's going to be a surplus over the next few years. Alex was playing that up. I was playing that down. The problem is because of the problems are twofold. First, because of the current economic crisis, the surplus, and it's only going to be for the next 7 years-ish. The surplus is going to be much smaller than we thought it was, although still there. And the second, and here Alex and I are definitely going to disagree, when we have that surplus, I don't think we're actually saving that money. I think what we're actually doing is transferring it over general revenue, and then politicians see that there's a smaller deficit or a larger surplus, and so they spend it on other things. And so while it's there on paper, I don't think it's there in any economic sense. The caveat is a couple years in the 90s, late 90s.
Great. One question?
Yeah, my name is Patrick, and I was just wondering, do you see any, are we going to see any movements on Social Security coming in the next 6 months? Healthcare got bogged down, and it's looking like it's going to take at least another month after the recess to get it done. When are we going to address Social Security? Maybe not your field of,
Political prognostication is a little less of what I do, but just from perusing the blogosphere, as I'm sure a lot of people here do, it seems like there are some rumors that there may be a deal going on with healthcare to bring it up later on, depending on what gets done, what kind of deal ultimately gets cut with healthcare. Either way, I think that it's going to be an issue that the Obama administration will take on by the end of its term.
I'm hearing the next president's budget may include Social Security, but
the next fiscal year?
Yeah. Well, that's when we'll start talking about it. But of course, it's the third rail of American politics, so who knows when we'll actually do something.
Great, thank you. Question right here?
Hi, my name is Alice. I'm one of the NASI interns. Okay. I think one of the questions we're talking about on that immigration, or we're talking about the administrative costs that like spending money will make money eventually. And one of the points that we heard earlier is that like the fertility rate and how that is affected like the growth trend in Social Security. And so do either of you think that investing in, giving men and women who decide to have children like either work credits for Social Security or childcare costs, which are more costly, I think, in the long run, if that is going to have an effect or it's something worth investing in?
To address your points in reverse, I think it is absolutely something that we need to invest in. We can think of Social Security as being part of the broader American welfare state that hasn't really kept up with how our economy has changed over time. The fact that we have single earner households, the fact that we have unmarried couples, the fact that the risks have changed over time and are no longer the same ones that Roosevelt was addressing when he created a lot of American social policy. And I think it'd be great to encourage more child care support, and I think that's a missing component of our welfare state. What sort of quantitative impact that'll have, I'm not certain, but I think either way that's something that we should address.
I think Alex is right. We need to think about how family structures are different now than when Social Security was created, or the 1939. Quantitatively, though, I think the costs of those credits would outweigh the incentive birth effects, because you're mostly going to be giving them to people who would be having children anyway. If they were all going to, if somehow we could find only the people that we thought weren't going to have children and give it to them, it might have a positive overall effect. But by the numbers, I think it would decrease solvency, not increase it.
Great, we have time for 3 more questions.
Hi, my name's Josh. I'm an intern with the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And my question is in regards to raising the retirement age. You both briefly discussed it. We are experiencing increasing life expectancy. Could we assume that we're also experiencing an increase in expectancy of your health and ability to work for more years than in the past? And if you do raise the working or the retirement age, could we incentivize help those people who are disproportionately negatively affected by increasing that retirement age, but still see a net positive gain overall with that increase in retirement age? You understand my question?
Your first, I get your first question, and that's a really a vital question. And in fact, being the econ wonk that I have slides on this point. If we go back, just really quickly, I don't know how fast it is to pull up, but showing disparities in health outcomes for the elderly by socioeconomic level for the high school versus college educated. And I don't know if we can pull it up or not, but what the slide shows is that the incidence of cardiovascular disease, this just looks at one thing, is just so much higher for the low SES socioeconomic groups amongst the elderly. And also over time, the life expectancy gap between the highest and lowest earners within the elderly has just phenomenally skyrocketed up as well. So we are looking at some pretty serious disparities in the health and life chances of the elderly. So I think it's a lot more complicated and a lot harder to talk about raising the retirement age given those health disparities. The second point was,
I was asking whether
can we compensate
compensate the low wage earners who are disproportionately
by somehow supporting them. There would
but
be
still see a net gain overall, perhaps.
I think that the administrative costs that you'd have to go through with that kind of a program would be pretty heavy. Off the top of my head, I can't forecast anything. You, Mark?
Yeah, I have no problem about forecasting things that I don't know numbers for. On your first point, as we are getting older, we are able to work more years, but not necessarily as many years as our life expectancy is increasing, would be my answer. We're actually retiring earlier than we were 30, 40 years ago. It used to be people would retire on average around 64, 65. Now they're retiring around 62, 63. I think that'll go up a little bit, especially because everyone's 401ks are empty now. But generally speaking, I don't think it's the case that we're now less able to work than we were. Less able to work now in a service economy when we're living longer than we were in a manufacturing economy when we weren't living as long. Can we raise retirement age and compensate the losers and still end up ahead? I think, yes, we can. France does it by having different retirement ages in different industries. I don't think we should go that route. But one thing we can do is strengthen the disability system and make it easier to collect, say, after age 60. Or we can create another type of retirement age that has some type of special early retirement age where you're evaluated if you really need it. We're never going to get everyone, and some people are going to always be hurt no matter what change we make. But I think we can end up ahead overall.
And another essential component to that would be really good comprehensive health reform. We see the near elderly having much poorer health outcomes, and then once they enter Medicare, they get healthier. So if we can give that same kind of universal, high-quality, affordable healthcare to everyone, especially the near elderly, hopefully they'll be able to be healthy enough to continue working. So,
thank you. We have another question here.
Can you kind of piggyback off of that question? I was wondering what you saw as maybe incentivizing employers to continue employing older people, because there is this sort of discrimination against, wanting to hire less risky, younger, perhaps better educated youth, or more updated at least.
If we're going to encourage people to work longer, we can't just do it through the Social Security system. You're right. I think there's a few things that we can do. One is we can sort of change the culture. That's a longer term thing, but I think we can start sending signals. One is we can change, or we can encourage private companies to change their pension rules. I think that a lot of pension rules drive people to retire earlier. But the third part is how do we get employers and employees to, want to hire early employees? And it's a tough question. Some of the anti-discrimination laws in place actually end up discouraging hiring of older employees. Some of it is there's a cultural thing where we're not necessarily willing to phase out retirement, to have people go from working 60 hours a week to 40 hours a week to 20 hours a week. Part of that is the culture. Part of that is just changing the way we do things.
yeah, I think the cultural angle is one that we should pursue. And like I said before, there should be in place incentives for those people who want to retire later. But I think by no means we should be forcing people who cannot retire or because of their health or other reasons to continue working in the labor market. So,
great questions. One more back there.
Hi, my name is Tracy McKee. I work for the Social Security Administration, and this is my first NASI meeting. I'm really excited to see the interns and all these bright, intelligent thinkers. My question is for Mark. In one of your slides, you said one of the benefits of later retirement are higher payroll tax revenues, and I was wondering if that's the case, why would you be opposed to raising or eliminating the cap on the amount of taxes that are collected on people that are earning over the 106.8. Well, it seems like you're getting taxes from somebody that might be 65, 70 years old, and it might not even be as much money as someone that's making $500,000 a year that's fully taxed for Social Security benefits. Social Security revenues.
Sure. Well, the difference is between more revenue and higher tax rates. We're getting more revenue because people would be working more. In theory, I think there should never have been a cap on Social Security. I would have preferred a lower overall rate and that all income be covered. The world we live in, we have to pay for other government programs, and there's only so much that you can raise people's taxes. When we start talking about, right now the top marginal tax rate is 35. It's going to move to 40. If we eliminate the cap, it's going to move to 52. If we then add this healthcare surtax, it's going to move to 58. And that's before state taxes. At some point, both politically and economically, you just can't tax people anymore. And I'm all for raising taxes. I think we need more revenue. We can't, as a society, afford to live off of 18% of GDP. But I just want to be careful which taxes we raise and what we want to spend them on.
Mr. Fernandez?
I think that that's where we clash. I presented that as one of my options, and presented also splitting the difference between employer and employee contributions somehow, and that would actually cover more than 75% of the projected shortfall. And I agree that it's important that we need to consider the marginal rates for the top earners, but I don't think it's such an issue for millionaires that we see behavioral effects. You don't see millionaires waking up in the morning and deciding that they're going to work just a little bit less because their tax rates have gone up and it's no longer worth their time to keep working. I do think we may see them shift around their income, as we definitely have seen them done in the past when top rates were raised. But I think it's also important to remember that top rates were considerably higher and in periods of much better economic growth in general. So it's something else to consider. It's also, as a final point, helpful to consider the income gains that have happened over the past 20 years and who they have accrued to. And the top 1% has grown at rates that are several times that of everyone else in the economy. And distributionally, is that something that is desirable or not?
Great. Well, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions. Please join me in thanking the two panelists.